Dorian couldn't have been more excited as he stood in front of his new apartment building. After months of searching, he had finally found a place that seemed perfect. A quiet, charming little building nestled on a narrow street, away from the noise and chaos of the city. It had been hard to find anything affordable that wasn't run down, but this place was different. The exterior had an old-fashioned charm, and despite its age, it looked well kept. The landlord, Mr. Vale, had been kind and professional when Dorian had met him earlier that day. A bit strange maybe, but nothing out of the ordinary. Everything seemed perfect. Dorian had been eager to move in, looking forward to starting fresh. As he unlocked the door to his new apartment and stepped inside, a sense of calm washed over him. The place was just as he remembered. A small, cozy one-bedroom with polished wooden floors and large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. He could already picture himself settling in, his favorite books stacked neatly on the shelves, the faint smell of fresh paint still lingering in the air. It felt like home. Just as he was unpacking a box, he noticed something strange. A thick envelope on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to him, though he hadn't seen it when he had first walked in. The handwriting on the front was neat but unfamiliar. It didn't look like a letter from the landlord, and there was no return address. Dorian hesitated for a moment before tearing it open, the envelope's paper rustling sharply in the silence. Inside there was a single piece of paper, what appeared to be a rulebook. He scanned the page. It looked like a list of instructions for living in the apartment. Some were simple, common-sense things like not making loud noises late at night or keeping the common areas clean. But one rule in particular caught his eye. Rule 7. Never, under any circumstances, leave the front door open past midnight. Dorian frowned, reading it again. It seemed odd, almost comical. Why would such a specific rule even exist? He could feel a small twinge of unease at the back of his mind, but he shrugged it off. It was probably just some eccentricity of the building, maybe something to do with security or the building's age. After all, the landlord, Mr. Vale, had seemed like a bit of an odd character. He had barely made eye contact when they spoke, and there was something unsettling about the way he talked about the place, almost like he was hiding something. But it was just a rule, right? Nothing to be worried about. He stuffed the rulebook into a drawer and continued unpacking. It was a fresh start, and he was determined to enjoy it. That night, as Dorian finally finished putting away the last of his things, he felt a sense of contentment. The apartment was quiet, and it felt like it was finally becoming his own. He sat on the couch, opened a book, and let the silence wrap around him. The hours passed quickly, and before long, the clock on the wall showed that it was nearly midnight. Dorian stretched and decided to grab a drink from the kitchen. He stood up and walked toward the door, which had been ajar since he'd moved in. The hallway outside was dimly lit, and the silence of the building made his footsteps feel unnaturally loud. He briefly considered closing the door, but then he remembered Rule 7. The idea of leaving the door open wasn't so strange, not really. He was in his own apartment after all. With a shrug, he stepped outside, keeping the door cracked open behind him as he made his way to the kitchen. The cold air from the hallway hit him, sending a small shiver down his spine, but he didn't think much of it. He got his drink, took a sip, and walked back to the living room. As he reached the doorway, he was about to push it closed when something made him pause. There was a sudden weight in the air, something he couldn't quite explain. He felt it first in his chest, a strange pressure that seemed to press in from all sides, suffocating the space around him. The apartment, once so cozy, suddenly felt wrong. The door swung shut behind him with a soft, almost imperceptible click. He froze, his heart racing. The temperature in the room had dropped, and a cold draft cut through the air. The lights flickered, a low hum filling the silence before everything went completely dark. Dorian's breath quickened. Something was off. A distant, almost imperceptible sound came from the hallway. a slow, deliberate creak. His mind raced to explain it away, but his gut told him that something was wrong, very wrong. The lights blinked back on, and for a moment, everything seemed fine. But as Dorian stepped further into the room, he felt it, a presence, cold and heavy, like a shadow pressing in on him. He turned toward the hallway, instinctively scanning the space beyond the door. The hallway was empty. But then he saw it, a dark shape, just barely visible at the edge of his vision. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, its figure casting a long, grotesque shadow across the floor. It didn't move, at least not at first. It simply stood there, watching. Dorian's heart skipped a beat. His legs felt heavy, like he was rooted to the spot. The shadow didn't make a sound, but he could feel its eyes. Unseen, but there, pressing into him. He quickly glanced away, his pulse hammering in his ears. When he looked back, the shadow was gone. But the air still felt thick, as though something was watching him. He stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, struggling to breathe as the coldness seemed to grow. The tension in the air hung heavy, suffocating. He couldn't tell if he was imagining it, but the room seemed smaller, the walls closer, like they were pressing in on him. Every creak, every faint rustle of the building seemed to echo in his mind. Was it just his nerves? He had to be imagining it. But then, the sound of footsteps came from the hallway, slow, deliberate, almost like a heavy tread against the floor. They were faint at first, barely audible over his racing heartbeat. But they were there, unmistakable, coming closer. Dorian's stomach lurched, a sense of dread flooding through him. His mind raced for an explanation. Maybe it was just the building settling, or the wind in the hallway. But deep down, he knew it was something else. Something he couldn't explain. And just as quickly as the footsteps had started, they stopped. Dead silence followed, a silence that screamed louder than anything. The door swung closed behind him with a sudden, unnerving force, the sound sharp and final. Dorian took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. Was it the wind? Was it just the building? He couldn't tell anymore. But that feeling, the one that told him something was wrong, never left him. The presence in the air, the shadow, the footsteps. It was all too much. Dorian stood there in the darkness, trying to convince himself that he was just being paranoid. But deep down, he knew this was no coincidence. Something was watching him. Something had been waiting for him. And it wasn't done yet. Dorian spent the next few days convincing himself that what he'd experienced the night before was nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. He wasn't someone to jump to conclusions or get spooked easily. After all, the building was old, and old buildings made strange noises. The shadows in the hallway could have been from the flickering lights. And the coldness? Well, it was winter. The heating system was probably just acting up. Still, something about Rule 7 gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The more he thought about it, the more intrigued he became. Why would the landlord go through the trouble of including such a specific rule in the first place? Never, under any circumstances, leave the front door open past midnight. What harm could it really cause? What would happen if he ignored it, just for one night? He figured it couldn't hurt to test it. It was ridiculous, really. He'd leave the door cracked open for just a few minutes, see if anything happened, and then shut it again. It would be a silly little experiment, nothing more. At night, as the clock ticked past 11, Dorian felt a sense of unease again. The apartment was eerily quiet, as though the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for something. He stood in front of the door, eyeing the handle. He could feel a small knot in his stomach, but he brushed it off. It was just his nerves, nothing more. With a slow, deliberate motion, he nudged the door open, just enough so that a sliver of the dark hallway outside was visible. He told himself he'd leave it open only for a moment, just long enough to satisfy his curiosity. He sat back down on the couch and stared at the door, waiting. The minutes stretched on, and everything felt normal. But then, as the clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, something began to change. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air turning cold and thick. A faint whisper seemed to drift through the crack in the door, so quiet at first that he thought he might have imagined it. But then it came again, softer than a breath, barely a murmur, but unmistakable. Dorian froze. His pulse quickened, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He strained his ears, trying to make out the words. It was almost as if something was speaking just out of reach, words he couldn't fully understand. Panic began to creep up from his chest, tightening around his throat. His mind screamed for him to close the door, to lock it, but his body refused to move. He felt a coldness that wasn't just from the temperature, but from the very air itself, as though the walls had turned to ice and were slowly closing in on him. The whispering grew louder, sharper, and suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. The door slammed shut with such force that the entire apartment seemed to shake. Dorian stumbled back, his heart racing. He stood frozen, staring at the door, waiting for it to open again, but nothing happened. The whispering had stopped. Everything was silent once more. His breath came in shallow gasps as he forced himself to approach the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. What if the hallway was empty? What if it wasn't? Dorian pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear anything. The silence that greeted him was deafening, and it made his skin crawl. With a deep breath, he finally decided to peer through the peephole, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. His heart was pounding so loudly that it felt as if it would drown out every sound in the room. He pressed his eye against the tiny lens, squinting into the darkness of the hallway. The faint light from the hallway's overhead bulbs barely cut through the shadows. At first, he saw nothing, just the empty stretch of corridor. But then, something moved. At the far end of the hallway, where the shadows seemed to thicken and twist, a tall, dark figure appeared. It wasn't clear at first, just a shadow, a silhouette standing unnaturally still, stretching far longer than it should have. Its shape was wrong, like it didn't belong in the world at all, and it felt as though the very air around it was bending. Dorian's breath caught in his throat. It was like looking at something that couldn't be real, a nightmare brought to life. A shape too tall, too thin, and yet too solid. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, casting an elongated shadow that stretched far across the walls. Dorian's hand shook against the doorframe, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. His mind screamed at him to turn away, to lock the door and hide, but he couldn't look away. There was something about the figure that hypnotized him, drawing him in despite the panic rising in his chest. Then, without warning, the figure's head jerked. It wasn't a natural motion, but a slow, unnatural tilt, as if the neck shouldn't have been able to move that way. Dorian's stomach dropped. The figure wasn't just standing there anymore. It was aware of him. It was looking at him. The weight of its gaze felt like it was pressing against him, and Dorian could almost feel its cold eyes through the peephole. His mind was in a frenzy, his thoughts scrambling to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this some kind of prank? Was he losing his mind? His heart pounded harder, and his breathing became erratic as his hand tightened on the door handle. He needed to open it. He needed to confront whatever this was. He had to see it for himself. With a sudden burst of courage, or maybe just desperation, he flung open the door. The hallway outside was empty. Nothing was there. No figure, no shadow, just the dark, empty hallway, stretching away into the distance. Dorian's chest tightened, and his mind raced as he stepped out into the hallway, his pulse quickening. The feeling of coldness clung to him like a second skin, and the silence in the air was suffocating. He scanned the hallway carefully, but there was no sign of the figure he had seen. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of panic clouding his thoughts. Maybe it had been an illusion, a trick of the light, but as he stood there, breathless and uncertain, the feeling of unease returned, stronger this time, deeper. Something was wrong. The building felt wrong. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he wasn't alone. Something had seen him. Something had been waiting for him. And whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. Dorian backed up into the apartment, quickly shutting the door behind him. The coldness lingered in the air, but the shadows, those strange moving shadows, were gone. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. The darkness beyond the door felt like it had just grown deeper, and the whispers were just beginning to gone, too soft to understand, but too close to ignore. The rulebook, the door, the shadows. What was it that he had let in by breaking Rule 7? The days following that terrifying night had not brought the relief Dorian had desperately hoped for. The events from the night he'd broken Rule 7 weighed heavily on his mind, their haunting images replaying in his thoughts at every turn. The strange occurrences didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied. It started small, an unexplained tapping noise from the walls, the faint murmur of whispers when the apartment was otherwise silent. The flickering lights seemed to follow him wherever he went, dimming whenever he reached out to turn them on, only to burst back into full brightness the moment he stepped away. But the worst part was the feeling, the sense that the apartment was pressing in on him, that the very walls themselves were closing in, suffocating him slowly. His nights were plagued with nightmares. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure, the dark, twisted shape that had haunted the hallway. In his dreams, it was closer, always just out of reach, but somehow always there, watching him from the corners of his vision, its head tilting at unnatural angles. Each time he tried to run, he was trapped, his legs heavy, as if the very ground beneath him was pulling him down into darkness. Each dream left him more terrified than the last, leaving him gasping for breath when he finally woke, drenched in cold sweat. It was impossible to ignore anymore. Dorian knew he couldn't stay in the apartment, but every time he thought of leaving, the walls seemed to grow tighter. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the entity that he felt lurking around him, or the growing sense that the building itself would not let him escape. Something was keeping him here. Something was pulling him in. Determined to find some kind of answer, Dorian decided to take matters into his own hands. He needed to understand what was happening, to confront whatever was behind the madness. The building's basement was his first stop. No one ever seemed to mention it, and he'd only ever passed by the door once or twice on his way in and out of the building. It wasn't a place he'd wanted to visit, but now it felt like the only option. Maybe there was something down there, some clue about the apartment or the strange rules that could explain everything. The basement was dank and smelled of mildew, its narrow stairwell leading down into a place that felt like it had been forgotten by time. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and age. Dorian hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, glancing around the dimly lit space. Crates and old furniture were stacked in haphazard piles, and the walls were lined with rusty pipes that groaned in the silence. As he moved further in, he felt the temperature drop. It was colder than the rest of the building, the air growing still and unsettling. He began to search through the piles of boxes and crates, the dust heavy in the air as he shuffled through old belongings. It was then that he spotted it. An old, forgotten stack of rulebooks, each one falling apart with age. Their worn covers were nearly unreadable, their pages yellowed and brittle. The labels on each book were handwritten. And as Dorian flipped through the first one, his eyes widened. The notes inside were not the neat, orderly instructions he had expected. Instead, they were jumbled, frantic, scribbled in the margins of the pages. The more he flipped through the books, the more the notes disturbed him. The writing was erratic, desperate, and chilling. Some tenants had written about strange sounds in the walls, of things moving when they shouldn't have, doors that opened and closed on their own, and a constant feeling of being watched. But the worst entries were the ones that spoke of unseen entities, of shapes and shadows that didn't belong, of whispers that never stopped, even during the day. One note was almost illegible, written in a frantic scrawl that seemed to have been written by someone on the verge of a breakdown. It read, "It knows when you're awake. It knows when you sleep. It watches from the dark." Dorian's heart raced as he read the notes. They all spoke of the same thing, a presence in the building, something that had been there long before he moved in. The tenants' warnings were consistent, their words desperate. It was clear that they had all experienced the same thing, the entity, the darkness that resided in the building, in the walls, in the very air itself. Dorian's breath quickened as he continued flipping through the pages. Each book seemed to get darker, the notes more frantic, more urgent. And then he found it, the last rulebook, hidden beneath a pile of others. The book was different. It was older, its leather cover cracked and worn. The pages inside were frayed, as though they had been handled too many times. And on the final page, there was one last note, scrawled in a shaky hand. The name at the bottom read, Iris, and Dorian's heart skipped a beat. The note was simple, yet its finality shook him to his core. It read, "If you've broken Rule 7, it's already too late. It comes for you. Don't try to leave. It will never let you go." Dorian stood frozen, the weight of the words crashing down on him. He felt sick to his stomach. It was too late. He had already broken Rule 7. He had let it in, whatever it was. And now, according to Iris, there was no escape. A cold shiver ran down Dorian's spine. He felt the air grow heavier, colder, and the walls seemed to close in even more tightly than before. A sudden creak echoed through the basement, followed by a low, guttural whisper. His name. His blood ran cold. He spun around, but the basement was empty. There was nothing there, just the shadows stretching across the walls. But something was wrong. Something was in the shadows, something that he couldn't see, but he could feel. He wasn't alone. The door to the basement slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the walls. Dorian jumped back, his heart pounding in his chest. Panic surged through him, but when he reached for the handle to open the door, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. He pounded on the door, his breath coming in panicked gasps, but there was no answer. And then, just at the edge of his vision, something moved. Something, or someone, was there, just out of sight, lurking in the dark corners of the basement. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Dorian, Dorian, Dorian." He froze, his blood running cold. He couldn't tell where the voice was coming from, but it was unmistakably close. Too close. Dorian's mind raced. His thoughts tangled in a web of fear and confusion as he stumbled back from the basement door. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, but no one was there. The coldness in the air felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing in, tightening around his chest. He had never felt so trapped, so utterly alone. The apartment that once seemed like a fresh start had now become a prison, a place he couldn't escape from. He was suffocating, both physically and mentally, and each passing second felt like it was dragging him deeper into some unseen, nightmarish abyss. The shadowy presence that haunted the building wasn't just in his mind anymore, it was real, and it was following him. Desperately, Dorian began searching for answers. He couldn't just sit back and let this unknown force consume him. He had to understand it, figure out what was happening and why. His curiosity, once a spark of hope, was now driven by terror. He scoured the apartment for any clue, any piece of information that could help him, but it was only when he began looking into the building's history that things started to make sense. And nothing he learned made him feel any safer. He started by asking around the building, trying to piece together any details about its past. No one seemed to know much, but there was one person who piqued his interest: the maintenance worker, Theo. Theo was quiet, often keeping to himself, but Dorian had noticed him in the halls before, lurking in the background, always with a watchful eye. Maybe Theo knew something. Maybe he could help. Dorian finally found Theo in the basement, his hands covered in grease as he worked on some old machinery. Dorian hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should bring up the strange occurrences he had been experiencing. But he couldn't hold back anymore. He needed answers. "Hey, Theo," Dorian began, his voice shaking. "I need to ask you something about the building and the things that have been happening." Theo didn't respond immediately. Instead, he wiped his hands on a rag and looked Dorian up and down, as if sizing him up. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You've been hearing it, haven't you?" he asked, his gaze not meeting Dorian's. The whispers, the shadows, the cold. Dorian froze. How did he know? "What's going on?" he asked, his voice a whisper now. Theo let out a long, heavy sigh. "You've been here long enough to realize that this building isn't like the others. It's different. It's old, and it's cursed." Dorian's heart pounded in his chest. "Cursed?" Theo nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. "There's something in the foundation of this place. Something ancient. Something that was bound here long ago to the building itself. It's been here for generations, and it feeds off fear. It's not a ghost, Dorian. It's something worse, something older. The rulebook thinks not just some silly precaution. It's a barrier, a way to keep it locked away." Dorian's stomach churned as Theo's words sank in. "What do you mean, locked away?" Theo looked around nervously, then leaned in close. "The entity, whatever it is, was bound to the building. It can't escape unless the door is left open. That's why Rule 7 exists. If you break it, it's free. The entity can roam the halls, look for new victims to feed off, and once it finds you, it won't stop. You won't be able to leave. It's already here, Dorian. It's been here for years." A wave of cold terror washed over Dorian. The air in the basement felt thicker, more oppressive, as though the walls themselves were alive, listening to their conversation. He could feel the weight of Theo's words pressing on him, and he shuddered. "But I broke the rule," Dorian whispered, his throat dry. "I left the door open." "It's too late for that now," Theo interrupted, his voice low and grim. "Once you've broken Rule 7, there's no turning back. Every tenant who's done it, they don't leave. They become a part of the building, a part of the entity." Dorian's pulse quickened as Theo's words sank in. "A part of the building? What do you mean? They're dead?" Dorian asked, barely able to say the words aloud. Theo didn't reply right away. Instead, he stood up and walked over to a small cabinet in the corner of the basement. He pulled out an old cracked mirror and held it up, staring into it for a long moment. Dorian was about to ask him what it meant when Theo finally spoke again. "They're not dead, not Ron. It's not the fear, but it doesn't just kill. It changes you. It takes pieces of you, and you become part of it." A part of the apartment itself. Dorian's eyes widened in horror. His reflection in the mirror seemed to twist and distort as he looked at it. For a brief moment, he thought he saw his own face change, his eyes hollow, his skin pale. It was as if he was no longer himself, but something else entirely. He blinked, and the image returned to normal, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. Theo looked at Dorian, his expression dark. "You've already been marked, Dorian. Look at yourself. You're changing." Dorian's breath caught in his throat as he turned to look at himself in the basement window. His reflection was distorted, just like in the mirror. His features were wrong. There was something off about him, something that couldn't be explained. The air in the room felt thick, the walls groaning as if the building itself was alive and breathing. He was trapped in a nightmare, and it was only getting worse. "The entity doesn't just haunt this place," Theo continued, his voice now barely a whisper. "It takes. It absorbs, and it won't stop until it's consumed everything. Including you." Dorian's heart pounded in his chest as he ran through the apartment, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He had to escape. The walls were closing in on him, the air thick with the smell of decay, the whispers growing louder. It was everywhere now, suffocating him, pulling at his sanity. The entity was here, it was real, and it was closing in. There was no way out, no escape. Every door he tried was locked, every window sealed shut. The building itself seemed to be holding him captive, trapping him in this nightmare with no way to break free. His mind raced. He thought of the rule, of the warning Theo had given him. But it was too late now. He had already broken Rule 7. There was no going back. The apartment was no longer just a place to live. It was a tomb, and he was its prisoner. Every time he moved, the darkness seemed to follow him, always just a step behind, its cold fingers brushing against the back of his neck. Desperation drove Dorian to the one thing he had been trying to avoid. He went to the door again, his hand shaking as he reached for the knob. Maybe if he broke the rule again, something would change. Maybe if he opened the door, he could somehow escape. It was the only thing left to try. With a trembling breath, Dorian twisted the handle and pulled the door open, the sound of it scraping against the frame echoing in the silence. But as the door creaked open, the air in the room grew heavier, darker, and a chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong. The whispers were louder now, like a chorus of voices, but they weren't just in his ears. They were in his mind, invading his thoughts, feeding off his fear. The moment the door fully opened, the entity revealed itself. At first, it was just a shape in the darkness, a flicker of movement in the corner of his vision. But as Dorian stared, trying to comprehend what he was seeing, the entity took shape. It was dark, shifting, and twisted, its form impossible to describe, like a thing made of shadows and nightmares. It was there, and yet it wasn't. It was everywhere, filling the room with its suffocating presence that seemed to twist the air around it. Dorian's stomach churned as the entity's voice filled his mind, its words sharp and cold. "You've broken the rule. Now you are mine," his mind screamed, trying to make sense of the words, trying to find a way out. But there was no way out. Not anymore. The entity didn't just haunt the building, it owned it. And now, it owned Dorian too. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more frantic, as though they were trying to drown him. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The walls seemed to shift, the very air around him twisting, as if the apartment itself was alive and closing in on him. The entity was feeding on his fear, and it was only getting stronger. And then, the truth hit him with the force of a hammer. The entity didn't kill. It didn't take lives. It took souls. It absorbed them, leaving nothing behind but empty shells. The tenants who had come before him, those whose names had been lost to time, they hadn't just disappeared. They had become part of the apartment. They were trapped in the walls, in the floors, in the very structure of the building itself. Dorian stumbled back, his hand still gripping the door frame. But it was too late. The entity was already inside him, filling his mind with its cold presence, twisting his thoughts. His body felt heavy, like it was no longer his own. He could feel his skin crawl, as though something was moving beneath it, something that wasn't part of him. His reflection in the hallway mirror caught his eye, and he froze. His face was wrong. His eyes were wide and hollow, his skin pale and drawn. The man staring back at him wasn't Dorian anymore. It was something else. Something that had already been absorbed into the apartment. As the entity closed in, Dorian's final thought was a chilling one. "I'm never leaving." And with that, the apartment claimed him. The doors slammed shut behind him, sealing him in with the entity. The building waited, its darkness spreading, waiting for the next tenant to break Rule 7. The cycle would begin again.